3, 2, 1. Good evening, class. I apologize for it taking until this Sunday. Happy Easter. But you will still have plenty of time to watch this video before we have class on the beginnings of World War II this coming Friday. Today we are going to talk about the Roaring 20s and the Depression 30s here in the United States. What were the effects of World War II, or World War I, I should say, on American culture, American politics, and the big one, of course, when it comes to the Great Depression, the economics here in this country. So let's get started. Now, just to kind of lay the framework really quick. Last class period we talked about the end of World War I, the effect of World War I. And of course, one of the things that's going to sort of set the tone here in the United States during the 1920s and the 1930s is the sense of not only the failure of the war to actually fix the world. The Treaty of Versailles will be rejected by the United States, and also a sense that the United States, the American people that is, was tricked. The American people were tricked into the war. This will cause Americans to revert to a policy of isolationism. This doesn't mean that Americans will not deal with anybody in the world. What it means is that the popular opinion here in this country will stress America staying out of other people's business, especially when it comes to Europe and Asia, whereas the United States will remain fairly heavily involved in the Western Hemisphere. As I said, President Woodrow Wilson, who negotiated the American side of the Versailles Treaty that included the League of Nations, will come home in 1919 and 1920, only to have the U.S. Senate, which has to ratify treaties, to have the U.S. Senate reject the Versailles Treaty. The United States will actually make a separate peace with Germany and Austria. And the United States will be, well, noticeably absent from the League of Nations. A little interesting side note, Woodrow Wilson will campaign heavily, crisscrossing the country, trying to build public support in order to pressure the Senate into ratifying the treaty. He will have a stroke. And from what we know now, the last year of his life, or the last year, I should say, of his presidency, the person actually signing his name to presidential documents was not Wilson, but his wife. So in a kind of an odd way, Wilson's wife was the de facto president during 1920. Now, Wilson will be superseded in, of course, the presidential election of 1920 by the Republican Warren G. Harding. Now, while Harding subscribes to the Republican isolationist platform, he does attempt to use American economic power and sort of the idea that America is an objective third party as a means of negotiating continued peace in the 1920s. In 1920 and 1922, the major powers, the major naval powers, will meet in Washington, D.C. to discuss naval disarmament. This becomes known as either the Washington Conference or sometimes called the Washington Naval Conference. The powers involved, of course, are the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. Sometimes the Washington Naval Conference is called the Five Power Agreement because it is made up of the five major naval powers of the 1920s. Now, what are they discussing at the Washington Naval Conference? Well, many believed that the naval arms race prior to World War I between Great Britain and Germany had helped initiate World War I. In the early 1920s, there was a fear that a similar naval arms race was developing between especially the United States, Great Britain, and Japan. In the wake of World War I, the defeat of Austria and Germany had left a little bit of a power vacuum in Africa and Asia. German colonies had been taken over by the Japanese in Asia and by the British and the French in Africa. This put these powers into, well, direct conflict with each other. The United States also in 1916, under Wilson, started a massive naval building program that by 1924 to 1925 would have made the United States Navy the largest navy in the world, superseding that of Great Britain. And of course the British saw this as a threat as well. So what comes out of this naval conference in Washington in 1921 and 1922? Well, arms limitation. Something along the same lines as the strategic arm limitation talks of the 1970s and 1980s. In 1922, the five powers agree to limit not only the number of battleships, but also the absolute tonnage of battleships. So the general twist to this naval conference or naval agreement is this. For 10 years, the five powers will not build any new battleships. They will have to make do with refitting their older ships. When they do build these ships, they cannot exceed 35,000 tons displacement, thus limiting their size. They also have a tonnage limitation for, well, that 10-year moratorium. So many of the older battleships will succumb to the scrapper's torch as the navies have to pare down their battleship fleets in order to fit the total tonnage allowed. Now, because the United States and Great Britain were seen as two ocean navies, operating in both the Pacific and the Atlantic, they were allowed a greater tonnage than the French and the Italians and the Japanese. Now, the Naval Conference in Washington, while it is signed by the Japanese in 1922, the Japanese militarists, the expansionists in Japan that will seize power in the late 1920s, will use this loss of face of not being considered equal with Great Britain and the United States as a way of ginning up militaristic expansionism among the Japanese population. Now, during the 1920s, the United States, except for conferences like the Washington Conference, will stay pretty much out of European affairs. This doesn't mean that the United States does not carry on normal diplomatic discourse with Europe or Asia, but it means that the United States is not going to, well, throw its white weight around. The United States is not going to, well, really get involved in many of the controversies that plague Europe during the 1920s. Why? Well, overall, American public opinion believes that, well, to put it bluntly, we were tricked into World War I. This culminates in the mid-1930s, in 1934 and 1935, in what becomes known as the Nye Committee hearings, held by Senator Gerald Nye. Now, the Nye Committee will only confirm what many Americans believed throughout the 1920s, and that was that American banks and American manufacturers had a vested interest in lobbying behind the scenes, pushing the American government into war, of course, in 1917. Now, this means, of course, that America will stay away from foreign entanglements, except for here in the Western Hemisphere. America will get involved in a series of small wars in places like Nicaragua, Haiti, and Cuba that collectively become known as the Banana Wars. Now, the reason why they become known as the Banana Wars to American historians is that, well, the reason why the Marines mainly, the Army in a few instances, but mainly U.S. Marines are sent into Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba to secure American well, business interests in those countries, most notably in the case of Nicaragua. Nicaragua sets the stage. In the mid-1920s, the American Fruit Company, today it is known as Dole, the American Fruit Company had a series of banana plantations in the country of Nicaragua there in Central America. Now, in the mid-1920s, a new government would come to power in Nicaragua and nationalize those banana plantations, basically stripping the American Fruit Company of, their property. The American Fruit Company would use their lobbying power within the U.S. government to get the U.S. government to send in the Marines to put it bluntly, overthrow the government of Nicaragua and secure those assets. In the cases of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, violent protest against all white Europeans would lead to the deployment of the U.S. Marines to protect not only American assets, but American lives. Because these are occurring in Central America, these, of course, take on the name the Banana Wars. Now, how can the U.S. justify involvement in Latin America but stay isolationist when it comes to the rest of the world? Well, American policymakers, like, for example, President Warren Harding and his successor Calvin Coolidge, would claim authority by what was passed back in the 1820s, known as the Monroe Doctrine, which is the idea that the Western Hemisphere is the backyard of the United States, and thus the United States has a right to police and make sure that that area is secure. Now, this hands-off policy to foreign affairs carries over into American domestic politics as well. When asked about American isolationism, President Warren G. Harding stressed what he called American dollar diplomacy. Instead of using the American military or U.S. diplomats for that reason, Harding argued that the economic weight of the United States could be used to, influence foreign countries and, of course, their governments. Now, Warren G. Harding may be known for his dollar diplomacy. However, he is best known for, to put it bluntly, having a very corrupt presidency. Harding, who would die in office August 2nd, 1923, will become involved in what is known as the Teapot Dome scandal. Now, Teapot Dome is the U.S. naval oil reserves located under Teapot Dome, Wyoming. It's basically a large oil field. Now, in 1922-1923, Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, will sell Teapot Dome, the Navy Petroleum Reserves in Wyoming, to private oil interest at a cut rate. I mean, dirt cheap. Senate hearings and investigative journalists will delve into this in 1923 to, basically show that Fall had cut the price in order to receive a kickback from American oil interest. During this time period, other scandals will come to the fore. Not only was Teapot Dome a major scandal for Harding, but his guidance as president was called into question, from appointments to the Justice Department, his Attorney General, the fact that many within his Justice Department were breaking federal law, because during the 1920s we have, of course, the era of Prohibition, and many within Harding's Justice Department were either seen as abusing the power given to them by Prohibition, or corrupt, basically selling or facilitating the sale of alcohol, which was of course forbidden. There's also a scandal involving the Veterans Bureau. Of course, the question becomes, were they skimming off the top? And this would lead finally to Harding's death while he was kind of trying to get away from the corruptions outside of Washington. He died of heart failure in 1923, leaving his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, in charge. Now, Coolidge, who, while part of the Harding administration, was seen as someone different. Someone who, let's see here, where was Coolidge come from? Let me find that really quick. He was from Vermont, and Coolidge was known for sort of being kind of prudish. He was your stereotypical man of Puritan background, hard worker, but had no vices of his own. And of course, this was a refreshing departure from the corruptions of 1923, when Coolidge, of course, becomes president. Now, Coolidge would campaign on basically a simple slogan: keep cool with Coolidge. Coolidge believed that the U.S. government's policies should be limited and should be used to facilitate American business interest. So you're not going to see very many social reforms. You're not going to see progressivism expressed in the same way that you did in previous presidents, especially that of Woodrow Wilson. Because Coolidge was, he was anti-progressive in many ways. He was a president who advocated that the government was not the authority to be turned to for social reform, for women's rights, for things like that. And thus, the best-known image of Calvin Coolidge was a president who oftentimes was a president who had nothing to do, because he believed that the president was merely there to carry out the orders of the legislature and not champion any cause, not push any agenda. And thus, there are numerous photographs of Calvin Coolidge sitting on his front porch, which during the presidency, his front porch was that of the White House, whittling. Now, why didn't Americans get all up in arms? Because aren't we a people who want our president to do something? Well, things were a little bit different back in the 1920s. Americans had kind of grown tired of American involvement overseas, American government's involvement in American society. It's during the 1920s that progressivism goes into decline, because Americans are tired of the social upheaval of the 19-teens, and of course the political and violent upheaval that was characterized by World War I of the late 19-teens and early 1920s. Americans wanted what President Harding called normalcy. They wanted to get back to an era of tranquility that Americans believed that preceded 1900. We see this in the American fascination with entertainment. Of course, it's in the 1920s that Hollywood comes of age in the 1920s. Before, of course, movies had been around since the late 1890s. However, it's during the 1920s that you have, of course, the heyday of the silent films. Of course, here we have Buster Keaton, one of the most famous comedic actors of the silent era of the 1920s. We also have Rudolph Valentino, who was the sex symbol of the 1920s until the talkies came out in 1929 and 1930, and it found the American moviegoers, especially American women who used to swoon over Valentino, found out that he talked kind of like this, which of course took away from his sex appeal. Americans shied away from controversial issues. For example, the late 1800s and the first decade of the 20th century had been an era of union unrest, labor unrest, union formation, things like that. However, after World War I, Americans feared that the union movement, the labor movement in this country, was a thinly veiled red conspiracy. It's in 1919, 1920, and 1921 that you have what many call the Red Scare, or the first Red Scare, because there'll be another Red Scare after World War II. The fear is that unionism in this country is a fertile garden, a fertile ground for communists, and especially after the fall of Russia to the Bolsheviks, the expansion of communism into Eastern Europe, where you see not communist governments like you see after World War II, but instead communist insurgencies, communist groups. Many feared that those same kind of groups could be here in the United States. It's in 1919 that you see Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, Alexander Palmer, create what becomes known then as the Bureau of Investigation. Of course, today we know it as the FBI. The first head of the Bureau of Investigation is probably the man whose stamp on the FBI is still there. And of course, I am talking about J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover would remain the head of the FBI from 1919 until the 1970s, very early 1970s. So the FBI, this paragon of law and order, was actually created as a way of sniffing out those that were seen as radical, those that were seen as possible dissidents, and Hoover was tasked with, well, arresting them and prosecuting them. And Americans were fine with this, because Americans sort of had a love-hate relationship with what we saw as radicals. In the mid-1920s, you have a court case involving two Italian immigrants. If I can give you their names here really quick. Nicola Sarco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. These were Italian immigrants. Both of them were shoemakers and laborers. They were charged in 1919 and 1920 of robbing a shoe factory and murdering one of the guards at the shoe factory. Now, both of these men were known to be anarchists. Anarchism is a political ideology believing in the destruction of all organizations. A belief that you must violently destroy the existing order. Now, both Sacco and Vanzetti were finally caught, put on trial, and condemned to death. They would both be executed by 1927. Actually, August 23rd, 1927, both of them are electrocuted. However, while many Americans used the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, not Sarco, but Sacco and Vanzetti, as illustrating the dangers of radical groups and radical politics in America. Others in America will champion their cause. They become what you might call criminal celebrities. And this explains why their trial was so long, and of course why there were numerous appeals and pleas for clemency. However, of course, by 1927, both men will be electrocuted. We also see trials that are made famous not because of the individuals, but because of what they are covering. One of them, of course, is interesting because it happens here in Tennessee. In the 1920s, the state legislature of Tennessee passes what becomes known as the Butler Act. Now, the Butler Act made it a state crime, a felony, to teach anything but creationism here in the United States in public schools. However, in 1925, a biology teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, so just down the road, it's if you go down I-40 and at the exit for Athens, instead of going east to Athens, you turn west and you go across the Tennessee River, you will find Dayton. In 1925, John Scopes, the biology teacher for the high school in Dayton, Tennessee, was charged with violating the Butler Act and put on trial. He is defended by the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. One of the most famous lawyers from the ACLU, a fellow by the name of Clarence Darrow, defends Butler, and the prosecution is headed by former vice president and presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan. Now, it's during this trial that the question of evolution becomes the crux of the matter, the pivotal point of the trial. So you have a legal trial arguing scientific fact. This is why the Scopes monkey trial, as it becomes known, is considered by many historians to be a farce, because evolution versus creationism is not the realm of legality. It's something to be considered theologically and scientifically. However, Scopes will lose. He will be fined. I believe he's fined just a few $100s. Of course, that's a lot of money back then. I'm trying to think what he... let's see here. Trying to think what he actually had to pay. $100, but that, of course, is in 1925 money, which would probably be around $1,500 to $2,000 today. Now, later on, during the appeals process, the Butler Act will be found to be unconstitutional because it breaches the freedom of speech clause of course, the Constitution. However, it's these issues, from the Red Scare to violent anarchists to liberals attacking traditional American values, which will help re-energize a group that had died off by the 1890s. The group that I'm talking about, of course, is the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this is not the same Klan that was born in the 1870s as a response to Reconstruction in the South. The new Ku Klux Klan is actually born in the North, in Ohio. The new Klan, which, of course, is the Klan that we have today, is, well, it incorporates some of the racist ideas of the original Klan. The idea that blacks should not be integrated into white society, but also combines it with anti-communism, anti-collectivism, combines it with anti-immigrantism, combines it with a hatred of, well, the Jews, anti-Semitism. So the new Ku Klux Klan markets itself to, of course, a mainly working class white population in America's industrial heartland, in places like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and of course its traditional home in the South. And so the reason why you have the Klan today is because of these fears that America's peace will be destroyed by these disruptive elements in American society. Now, one thing that the Klan will rebel against, as well as many traditional Americans will rebel against, is, of course, is the fact that the Roaring Twenties are a time when, on the one hand, Americans are desiring peace, but other Americans are desiring, well, they're wanting to break out of traditional American molds. Many historians have argued that it's the 1920s where you see two generations of Americans. One generation wanting to return to the past, the younger generation, of course, wanting to see, well, change. And we see this best illustrated in the issue of Prohibition. Of course, Prohibition was passed as the Volstead Act, becoming an amendment to the Constitution in 1919, where the sale and manufacture of alcohol are made illegal. Actually, drinking alcohol, here's the irony of Prohibition. It is not illegal to drink alcohol. You can drink alcohol all day under Prohibition. It is the sale and manufacture of alcohol that is made illegal by Prohibition. And thus, you have this demand for intoxicating beverages, where if you are the person actually drinking alcohol, there are very few punishments for it. It is the prohibition laws are designed to crack down on those providing alcohol to the clients, not the actual clients themselves. And what we see in the 1920s is we see a large group of Americans, mainly young Americans, Americans in their 20s and their 30s, who want to experience life, where the booming economy of the 1920s has provided them with, well, they're flush with cash, they're bored, and they're no longer interested in the causes of their parents. They're no longer as interested in progressive reform and things like that. Instead, they're out to have a good time for both men and women. And so, where do young people go to have fun? You know, well, bars. I mean, even today, that's where you go to have fun. That's where guys go to pick up chicks, not to sound crass. But if the sale of alcohol is illegal, you're not going to have any bars. You're not going to have any beer or liquor manufacturers, brewers. Legitimate manufacture and brewing become illegal. The reason why Anheuser-Busch, their symbol are the Clydesdales and the wagons. Because Budweiser, no, it's not Anheuser-Busch, it's Budweiser, sorry, it's Budweiser. Well, it's Busch or Budweiser, I can't remember which one, but one of them, their symbol is, of course, the Clydesdales and the Red Wagon. Well, the reason why their symbol is that is because in the 1920s, that company had to give up brewing beer and instead make wagons. They had made wagons before to transport their beer, so they basically expanded one operation while quitting the other. So if there's no legal way to get alcohol, of course, this means that those wanting alcohol and wanting to have a good time have to find it somewhere else. And this, of course, gives birth to the speakeasy. Now, the speakeasy gets its name because many of these bars and restaurants are quite lavish inside, but they are hidden away. They are not on the main drag. They are not on Main Street with glass-fronted shops. They are instead down dark alleys, and in rural areas, back roads. But if you were in New York or Chicago, you would of course have to know someone who had been to the speakeasy, who knew where it was at, but also could give you the password, because you would approach the door and knock on it. And of course, a little bitty window would slide open, and they would ask you in a soft voice, "What's the password?" And you were supposed to, "Banana cream pie." Whatever the password was. But you're not supposed to yell it, because the cop on the beat may be patrolling the road, the main street, just a few yards away. So you knock on the door and you say, "Rumpelstiltskin," and they let you in. And Chicago, of course, became famous for its speakeasies because some of them were quite lavish. You would go down into the basement where this entire room was purposely built. Some of these things were quite elaborate, where the building was the actual basement was sound insulated, where you could have a band going and people, partying it up, and no one would be the wiser out on the street. Of course, the reason why you're coming to the speakeasy in the first place is to get liquored up. And they had plenty of liquor, no beer. Because like the drug war that we have today, the economic incentive was to get more bang for your buck. That's why during Prohibition, you don't see beer runners. You don't see beer brewing. You see moonshiners and you see rum runners. You see men and women who are willing to break the law to supply this great demand for alcohol. And of course, if you're going to run through say, the Tennessee backwoods, transporting white lightning, or if you're going to serendipitously land, like a military operation, a few crates of Canadian whiskey on the coast of America's eastern shores or on the southern shores of the Great Lakes, you don't want beer. You want something that they can make mixed drinks out of. Things like vodka, whiskey, scotch. And this, of course, will lead to an explosion in organized crime, because the one organization in this country that, of course, is willing to break the law and has the organization already in place to expand to meet the challenge are the gangs of America's major cities. Many historians, including yours truly, make the argument that the modern problem of organized crime is a direct result of, policies like Prohibition, because the American mafia before the 1920s was basically a few crime families that often went to war with each other in New York, and they were limited to New York and northern New Jersey. However, since more Americans were interested in drinking alcohol than gambling and prostitution, this was a lucrative enterprise. And it was a lucrative enterprise that expanded beyond the boundaries of America's major cities. And so it is the mob, the American mafia, that not only has the organization, but also the willingness to use violence in order to secure their assets and sell their assets, that will basically step to the fore. So the Italian mafia will supersede all the other criminal gangs, will surpass America's law enforcement ability in many areas because of this lucrative nature of Prohibition. One of the most notable sort of symbols of this criminal enterprise is, of course, Al Capone. Now, Al Capone was originally sent to Chicago by the crime families of New York to tie Chicago to New York, because New York becomes the hub during the 1920s. It becomes the hub of transportation of alcohol out of Canada to America's other major cities, whether it be New York and Philadelphia on the eastern seaboard, or cities further south, as far south as, Nashville, for example. However, Capone will seize the reins of power by the late 1920s, making himself a force to be reckoned with, independent of his original ties to the mafia. So he's actually not mafia by the late 1920s. Al Capone is actually his own mob. And to show you how lucrative this enterprise is, Al Capone employs hundreds of individuals. He is one of the richest men in America by 1928, 1929, when he's put on trial. He is able to skirt the law just by buying off judges and police chiefs. He is immune because of his wealth, and because he also will resort to violence whenever necessary. So, why do we see this explosion of crime? Well, we see this explosion of crime because normal Americans, normal, law-abiding Americans, are willing to break the law in order to have a good time. Normal Americans are also wanting to break with traditional values. Women, of course, will take on a new sort of aura in the 1920s. Before World War I, women, of course, continued the fight for suffrage. However, by the 1920s, women have the right to vote. However, this is the seeming irony of this victory. While during the first decades of the 20th century, so 1900 to 1920, you see American women fight and be, labeled as radicals and labeled as everything from lesbians to men haters because they just, they want the right to vote. But when they get the right to vote, this revolutionary zeal that they had expressed almost disappears. Instead, women are going to express themselves in different ways. Instead of at the ballot box, women are going to express themselves in how they dress, how they act, whether or not they're employed. Because the symbol of the new woman of the 1920s is this picture right here. This, of course, is your stereotypical flapper. Flappers get their name from the short dresses that they wore, and, of course, the apparel that they wore, that when they dances like the Charleston, which were very sexually charged by those standards, their garments tended to flap as they danced. As you can see from both of these pictures, women are willing to show some skin because, of course, before World War I, it was seen as immodest for women to wear anything that was above their ankle, and to wear anything that did not at least come down to close to their wrist. Prior to 1910, women still dressed in a Victorian fashion. Of course, Victorian culture was that of modesty, especially for women, but also men. Men, of course, didn't wear short sleeves before World War I. Collars were always buttoned to the neck before World War I for both men and women. Of course, men got to wear pants, but you didn't wear shorts. You wore a suit, and you always wore a hat. Now, by the 1920s, of course, men will start wearing short sleeves, but the more radical change will, of course, be in women's apparel, especially when they go to speakeasies or go out on the town. You see them, of course, showing more. They're showing their calves. They're showing their arms. They're not, if I can get my little pointer to work here, they're not wearing hats. They're wearing hairstyles where their hair is bobbed in sort of a page boy fashion. And of course, instead of being prim and proper, they are, as you can see from this picture right here, they're living it up. They are interacting very closely with their male counterparts. So for both men and women, the 1920s, especially young men and women, the 1920s are a time period of asserting their own independence, not only in terms of using cars, this new transportation device, of leaving the family home, of having fun, of having a job, because the 1920s is an era of the middle class clerk, the middle class accountant, the middle class, department store worker, mainly women. This is a time period where this generation is one of the first generations to be financially independent and culturally independent of their parents. We also see black Americans trying to assert their independence as well. We see this in the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, which of course occurs during the 1920s, is an explosion of art and music, writing, and fashion that is centered in, of course, Harlem, which is north of New York City. It's one of the boroughs of New York City, actually. We sort of see, of course, the writings of men like Langston Hughes, the orchestra and music of men like Duke Ellington. We see writing, we see fashion. Not just being limited to Harlem, because what makes the Harlem Renaissance stand apart from previous sort of black movements in this country is that this will expand to mainstream white culture as well. Of course, Duke Ellington, by the late 1920s and 1930s, will become famous for his new style. His style, of course, will contribute heavily to a new musical style that today we call, of course, jazz. Now, jazz is, if you don't mind me really quickly checking my notes because they're not available on the screen that I'm working from, that is filming from. You know, jazz, that is a combination of, well, African bass beat rhythm, the drums, but European brass instruments, you know, things like trumpets and saxophone. The combination of this with some of the elements coming from blues, for example, has a more upbeat tone, a faster tone, a danceable tone, something that blues really, you really can't dance to blues. You can dance to jazz. Jazz is the style that these people right here are listening to, and of course jazz is fundamentally a black musical style. While it has elements of white instrumentation, it would not be jazz without the African American influence. Great times of the 1920s. Sometimes I wish I could be one of these time travelers and go back and experience the 1920s. I love the architecture of the 1920s. The 1920s are also the heyday of radio in this country. Before 1920, you did not have radio stations. Very few people knew what a radio was. During the 1920s, you see an explosion of privately owned radio. The ham radio operator comes into his own. Of course, by the mid-1920s, these small stations, many of them are bought up by financial interests to form America's broadcast networks. NBC, RKO, CBS, ABC. These are not TV channels originally. They are originally radio stations. Radio becomes that link that Americans initially have with each other. Radio, of course, will help Americanize people, help change our culture, make it national, even more national. Not just in what we read in national magazines, but how we even talk. The 1920s were seemingly a great time in America. The economy seemingly was booming. The economy seemingly had no ceiling. And of course, Americans will learn the hard way that the 1920s, the prosperity of the 1920s, was bought at a major price. Because the reason why the 1920s boomed was because of easy credit. We often hear that Americans are addicted to debt or credit in this country today, whether it be student loan debt, credit card debt, housing debt. But the origins of America's addiction with credit, or easy credit, easy money, goes all the way back to the 1920s. It's during the 1920s that you see Americans going into debt in a large way for the first time in our history. Americans, of course, will take out loans to buy houses. They will take out loans to buy cars. They will get the first credit cards. Now, you don't have your accepted everywhere credit cards that you have today, but you had store cards. And people will use those store cards to buy consumer goods, like, for example, radios. Many Americans will actually take out loans to play the stock market, because with the booming economy, the stock market climbs to heights that it had never seen before, and Americans thought that they could make easy money playing the stock market. However, all of these benefits are just on the surface. By the late 1920s, there are dark signs if Americans were willing to look. One of the dark signs is that American manufacturers by the late 1920s were overproducing. The easy credit that Americans had enjoyed throughout the 1920s meant that they had started out buying stuff at a rate that gave incentive for manufacturers just to make more and make it faster. The problem is there's only so many widgets that you can sell. The American market was becoming flooded with cars, radios, and things like that. By 1928, just a year before the stock market crash, American manufacturers were warehousing. This means that they were sticking stuff in warehouses. They were warehousing more of the stuff they were making than sending it out to be sold. Another area that remained weak and never experienced the boom of the 1920s are American farmers. While American manufacturers, American workers, America's new middle class was having a great time during that decade, farmers were not. The plight of farmers can be traced back to before America's involvement in World War I. Because of World War I, agricultural prices for especially grains, but also meat, exploded as American farmers could take advantage of, well, the fact that European farmers were not producing. So they were, you have this high demand in Europe for, grains and cereal items and meat. And it's a seller's market. Many farmers would take out loans to take advantage of this seller's market, to invest in things like the new farm tractors, new farm implements, so that they could move away from hand cultivation to mechanization. When the U.S. government declared war in April of 1917, the U.S. government would give incentives to farmers to take out these loans, to expand production. However, when America, of course, when the world sees the end of World War I and European farmers go back to farming, the agricultural sector collapses, meaning that you have American farmers that are now heavily in debt who had expected high prices. Now those prices have collapsed and they can barely meet the payments. Many farmers, of course, will take out more loans to pay off old loans. Now, this debt is not limited to American consumers nor American farmers. This debt is international in scope. As we'll talk about later on, the U.S. government in 1927 will help negotiate what becomes known as the Dawes Plan. Charles Dawes, who was the vice president under Calvin Coolidge, will help negotiate a plan to economically restabilize Europe. Under the Dawes Plan, the U.S. government will guarantee loans from American banks to Germany so that Germany can pay off its debts, its reparations, to the victorious allies, Britain and France. And of course, Britain and France have considerable debts to pay off to the United States. So imagine this: you have American banks giving money to the Germans, who take some of that money and pay off their debts, their reparation to the Allies, who then turn and pay it back to those same American banks. I had a friend who knows more about economics than I do, and I kind of said, this doesn't make any sense. Banks are loaning money to get paid back the same money. And my friend put it to me this way. He said that economies are not driven by the cash alone. Economies are not just driven by how much stuff you have and how much you're selling it for. Instead, he put it to me this way. The reason why, at least in the short term, a credit debt system works, where people take out money they don't have, and the economy looks to be going great, is that the money is still flowing. He said, an economy works as long as the money is flowing. The moment the money stops, whether it be I don't have the money to buy stuff, or in a debt credit system, the banks don't have the money to loan, that's when the economy crashes. Now keep that in mind, because this super inflated stock market, this stock market that Americans had been playing, many of them going into debt, expecting the stocks that they're buying to be worth more, thus they can pay off not only the initial price, but also pay off the interest of the loan that they took out to buy the stock in the first place. Well, on October 24th, what is known as Black Thursday of 1929, the stock market will hiccup. Here is the hiccup, right there. It will recover slightly the next Monday, but then Black Tuesday hits. This is Black Tuesday. Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. The stock market drops 40% of its value. And as you can see, over the next 2 to 3 years, it will make some recovery and then crash. A little recovery, crash. This wipes out the financial sector. It snowballs because of this interconnected debt system that has been created in the 1920s. So this is what happens. Americans, your average American who has went into debt to buy a house, to buy a car, to buy radios. Some Americans who've went into debt to buy, stocks. Farmers who have went into debt to buy farm implements. And of course, this international debt cycle between the United States, Germany, and Britain and France. Keep this all in mind, because this is very complex, and I'm going to try and make it as simple as possible, hopefully not oversimplifying it, because when the stock market crashes, it creates a level of uncertainty, a level of fear in the financial sector of the United States. So banks are less willing to loan more money. Americans are not willing to spend as much money. By 1929, the stock market is just the tip of the iceberg, sort of the match that sets fire to this house of cards. Because, as I said, by 1928, there are more things being stored than sold in this country. So you have a confluence of events where companies, having overproduced, start to lay off workers. They start to lay off workers because they no longer need them. They've actually got more crap to sell than they need produced. Of course, these workers have their own financial obligations. These workers, of course, have home loans and car loans. And, of course, they can't repay them. You have banks who are now scared. Banks that are unwilling to loan more money. They start calling loans. And how do you call a loan? Well, you can't According to most loans, you just can't go and say, pay me your money. But look at any credit card. When the economy gets bad, what happens to your credit card interest rate? They call loans by jacking up the interest rate. This, of course, they hope will give incentive for people to pay back their loans. Of course, people don't have the money to pay back their loans. And so these jacked up interest rates hurt people even more. Sorry, I just hit my my screen there, so that's why I went up and down there for a minute. But so people can't, they can't pay back their loans. The large banks call their loans that they made to medium and small banks. The small banks don't have the money because they've given out the home loans and the car loans. So the small banks fail because when Americans fear that the financial institutions are insolvent, they make a run on these banks. And of course, these banks do not have the money to pay back everybody's savings account. What's scary today, guys, is that we are even in worse shape. Today, banks have less than 5% of the money that you have out there. So think of it this way. Of all the people that have their money in Bank of America has maybe 5, at most 10% of that money ready to give back. So if everybody went and made a run on the bank wanting their money, only 10% of Americans will be able to get all of their money back. The rest of Americans will have to do with considerably less or none at all. And this is what happens. Because once the banks run out of money, they fail. They go out of business. And they take people's savings accounts with them. So, especially America's middle class, who do not have large assets like the wealthy elite. And of course, it doesn't hurt the working class as much because they just don't have the money in the banks. It's the middle class that gets hurt the most by the Great Depression because their savings accounts are wiped out. They are put out of work. And of course, they have their homes and their cars and their other assets repossessed. And of course, this leads to the Great Depression, of course, because as you can see, two graphs that kind of illustrate the point. We have, of course, the stock market. Starting out here in 1929, it has reached this pinnacle that many people believed would last forever. It crashes, and it continues to crash until it gets down here to 1932. As you can see, if the stock market is any indication of economic health, this is, to put it bluntly, piss poor. Look at the number of banks. In 1926, we have a considerable number. They were already in decline due to consolidations, but because of the crash of 1929, you see them drop off, so that again, by 1932, 1933, they are at their lowest point. So 1930 to 1932 are terrible years for Americans. By 1932, look at this, guys. This is the American unemployment rate from 1929 to 1942. So the start of World War II is the end date. Right before the Great Depression starts in October of 29 is the start date. So almost zero unemployment here. I mean, almost everybody's working. And then the crash happens. American manufacturers lay off workers. So that by 1932, 1933, you have over 25% unemployment. This means people without a job. This is not those that are underemployed, working part-time. This is not the ones that are even not reported. So you have people that are jobless and homeless. And those that have nothing to lose, well, they hit the streets. They hit the streets in the form of protest, but more importantly, they hit the streets looking for work. Americans, of course, become a transitory nation. The modern hobo is born as Americans, hit railroad tracks. They jump trains in America's cities. Charity groups form bread lines. However, just the sheer number of homeless and jobless Americans swamp normal charities, churches, and religious groups, and groups like that. As a result, basic necessities, whether it be running water, housing, food, they become scarce. And when people become desperate, that's when revolutions occur. So regardless of our beliefs about the New Deal, because you're talking to somebody right here that believes the New Deal actually helped contribute to the length of the Great Depression, I do agree with many that would say that something had to be done, because in 1930 to 1932, this would have been the perfect time for major civil unrest. Now, Herbert Hoover was not just a president who sat on his tail. Herbert Hoover did try to restart the economy. He helped shepherd through Congress what becomes known as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. The RFC was given a basic operating budget of basically $500 million, and it was aimed at re-stimulating the economy by loaning it to solvent manufacturers so that they would keep people employed. However, the Great Depression was the result of major economic problems caused by this artificial nature of easy money in the economy. So just giving people a job would not fix this, and thus the RFC fails. As we saw with unemployment, it continued to climb. Hoover refrains from publicly supporting government action, instead stressing charity and volunteer work, because this is how Hoover put it. Hoover argued that if the U.S. government created a welfare state, what in Europe was already being called the dole by the early 1930s, that if the U.S. created a similar system of just handing out money to those that needed it, the U.S. would, in effect, create a permanent underclass that was dependent upon government handouts, and thus permanent poor people. However, Hoover's principled stand, whether you agree with it or not, led people to hate his guts. Because it seemed, at least to Americans, that the U.S. government was not doing anything. That nobody was doing anything. And instead, the only people who were advocating, of course, any form of action were those who were, how would you say, of the radical bend. We see the reignition of management labor disputes, layoffs by management, strikes by unions. Now, one thing you've got to remember is that at least up until 1936, unions for the most part in this country were still considered legal and not recognized under the law. So this added to the violence of these management labor disputes. Throughout the country, you see, of course, transitory hobo towns, little shack villages, tent cities. Because Herbert Hoover was not apparently doing anything about it, many Americans simply called them Hoovervilles. They called the jalopies that seemingly transported more people than what they were designed for. Cars basically just loaded down to the axle. They called them Hoovermobiles. They called somebody sitting on a park bench covered by a newspaper to be covered by a Hoover blanket. Hoover was, regardless of what he actually thought, was, not ready to handle the situation. And so in 1932, an event that marks let's just put it this way, marks Hoover's political death. This, of course, is the Bonus March. In 1932, let's see if I can give you an actual date here. In the summer of 1932, close to 43,000 veterans of World War I march on Washington, D.C. They march on D.C. to demand that their bonuses that they were promised at the end of World War I, should be paid in full immediately. These bonuses were designed in 1919 and 1920 to be paid out piecemeal to those that had served overseas in combat. However, because many veterans were those in unemployment lines, they believed that the U.S. government should go ahead and pay them most of their bonuses up front. And they marched on Washington to demand this, and they set up their own Hooverville on the Mall, that big open space in Washington, D.C. This scares the shit out of Hoover and those in Washington. You have 43,000 veterans, so these are people who are combat tested, men who have probably killed before. They've killed in the name of their country, but they've killed nonetheless. They have fought, and they know how to fight. The fear is that they are just the tip of the iceberg of a possible revolution. This causes the U.S. government to act, and what happens is, you see the U.S. Army called in. So you have current soldiers who are ordered to disperse the crowd made up of former soldiers. The man in charge of this is none other than the head of the U.S. Army at the time, Douglas MacArthur, a man who will become worshipped as part of World War II. He will order tanks be used to basically run down the shacks built in the Washington Hooverville. Tear gas will be used against American civilians. And of course, the Hooverville is destroyed. The bonus marchers are forced to disperse. This, of course, makes Herbert Hoover look incredibly terrible and helps lead to the landslide victory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who we will talk about in just a minute. Now, let's talk about American farmers. This part of American society that wasn't doing well during the 1920s, they are doubly hurt by the Great Depression. It's during 1930 and 1931 that you have a major drought that stretches from western Missouri through Oklahoma, Texas, the northern part of Texas, Iowa, basically America's breadbasket. This drought is caused by two things. First, lack of rain, the classical definition of a drought, but also because during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, new methods of mechanized farming had chopped the soil up of America's breadbasket. It basically cultivated it to the point where it was a fine mess. Now, when it rained, it was all right. However, 2 years of drought had dried the topsoil out to the point where it was the consistency of chalk dust, of talcum powder. And it started to blow away. You see dust storms here. You see farms, as you can tell, completely buried. You see agriculture wiped out, as not only are the crops unable to grow, but the topsoil is literally blown away, and these dust storms could actually threaten human life. If you were caught out in these dust storms, you could literally choke to death. And this leaves many from Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas no other choice but to pack up what they can and try and find work somewhere else. They start heading west. They start heading to California. Now, these Okies, as they become known, because Oklahoma is probably the biggest, the entire state is hit by this Great Depression. But it's also people from Missouri and Kansas and Texas that also head to California. They head to California looking for better work. They head to California because California growers had been advertising for labor in these areas. Now, of course, early on, those people who get there first will find work. But of course, as more and more of these Okies flood into California, you see the labor market crash. This is why if you go back here, you see signs like this. Around America, jobless men keep going. We can't take care of our own. In California, you see these migratory camps as laborers either fail to find work or they are working for pennies on the dollar of what that labor was worth just a year or so before. So in the end, what do we have here? We have American industrial workers out of work, farmers moving about. We have hobos. America is coming apart. It's into this seemingly disaster that many believe their savior came. This accounts, the depth of America's despair in 1932 accounts for the almost mythical image that Franklin Delano Roosevelt still has even today. Because the economy was in the toilet. I mean, seriously, the economy was the worst it had ever been in mid-1932. 25% or more of Americans were completely out of work. Many, many more were underemployed. Many, many more were, having to sell off everything that they owned in order to survive. Hoover, as president, was seen as a principled fool, whereas you have Franklin Roosevelt coming in during the 1932 campaign and promising vigorous action. The funny thing is nobody, even his closest advisors, could tell anybody what that vigorous action was. But the fact was Americans were ready for anything. They didn't care what it was. And at least in the Northeast, many knew of Roosevelt's record. He had been governor of New York State, and after the crash in 1929 had implemented many similar policies that he would champion as president at the state level. Of course, he sweeps the election. As you can see right here, this is an election map of the U.S., and as some of you kind of will notice, what is considered today the liberal Democratic Northeast, well, New York State is almost solidly Republican. Maine and New Hampshire, Vermont, the centermost portion of Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. It's the South and the West that are solidly Democratic blue. Roosevelt sweeps the election, one of the biggest landslide victories in American history, and immediately during his first 100 days implements what becomes known as the First New Deal. And he brings with him what becomes known as his brain trust. Now, who are the brain trust? Well, the brain trust are individuals that will become better known as the New Dealers. These are the men and a few women that are the people who are pushing various different programs. Some of them not always in sync with each other, but they are the ones pursuing these programs. Men like, for example, Adolph Burl, Harry Hopkins, Harold Ickes, Rexford Tugford, Louis Brandeis, who will go on to be the Supreme Court head justice, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. These individuals are pulled from high-priced law offices in the Northeast, out of academia, or out of government itself. Frances Perkins, for example, is noteworthy because she becomes the first first female Secretary of Labor. So you have these men and women who look upon this election as a godsend, because many of these New Dealers, most notably a man by the name of Rexford Tugford, will advocate the complete remaking of the U.S. In terms of how the government interacts with the population. So what are some of the policies of this first New Deal? Well, in order to stabilize finances, FDR declares a banking holiday. The Emergency Banking Act of 1933 closes American banks for several weeks. It also, get this guys, it also requires all Americans who hold gold to sell it to the government. Now, why would FDR want to do this? Well, FDR, depending on who you talk to, first off, wants to prevent any bank runs. Why would he want Americans to be forced to give up all of their gold? Well, this would tie Americans back to that financial system based on the U.S. dollar. As well as the Emergency Banking Act, FDR will shepherd through Congress what becomes known as Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall is important because up until the late 1990s, the American financial institutions could not combine private assets with investment assets. So this is what Glass-Steagall does, if I can use my limited knowledge of American financial institutions to clarify the subject. Before Glass-Steagall, large banking institutions could use money, like your savings account, in risky investment ventures. So if I was, say, Chase Morgan, I could use money that people had put into my bank, their checking account, their savings account. I could use that money to give to startup corporations or to play the stock market. Glass-Steagall says, no, you can't do that. Glass-Steagall limited what financial institutions could do between investment banking, stock market, startup corporations and stuff like that, and individualized private banking. The reason why Glass-Steagall is important for us is this. It didn't end overnight, but starting in the mid-1990s, Glass-Steagall was effectively neutered so that by 2008, there was no limitation. There was no restrictions between making these two the same. And one of the things that American banks did in the mid-2000s was to make home loans a financial instrument. I don't know if you've heard of what is known as derivatives, but one of the things that big American banks did was they took home loans, packaged them together, divvied them up into units like you would do a stock or a bond, and then sold them off. The value coming from the fact that somebody was going to pay that loan. Of course, when the housing market crashed, these derivatives became worthless, and anybody who invested in them basically just had a crap load of paper. And this, of course, the derivative bubble, as it becomes known, in 2008, helps contribute to the housing market crash, and why the housing market crash of 2008 went far beyond just the housing market and housing industry and affects everything even today, is because we did not have these limitations. It's also during the first 100 days that we see what I affectionately call Roosevelt's alphabet agencies. You have the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps. You see the passage of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Projects Works Administration, and the National Recovery Act. Now, so the NRA here is not the National Rifle Association, but the National Recovery Act. What are the purposes of these agencies and laws? Well, on the one hand, they provide work. The Civilian Conservation Corps, for example, provided employment doing conservation work and also building the park. The Smoky Mountains National Park up here was built by the CCC. The TVA, of course, was given authority and given the power to dam rivers like the Tennessee River to provide power to those areas that had historically been, well, they didn't have it. And of course, the Project Works Administration was tasked with giving middle-aged men, married men, jobs if they were unemployed as well. Now, that's one aspect of these alphabet agencies. But if you read the writings of some of the members of the Brain Trust, some of these New Dealers believe these alphabet agencies could be used to do more, to change America fundamentally. Rexford Tugford, who was probably the biggest proponent of keeping the government involved in American society and the American economy, believed that these alphabet agencies could become permanent parts of the American, landscape, where American young men would naturally go into this what becomes known as a forest army, this conservation army, the CCCs. Why? Well, if young men are in the CCCs using government funds to build parks and stuff like that, then they will not be entering the labor force and thus keeping labor prices high. Likewise, the Agricultural Adjustment Act set up a system where the U.S. government would pay farmers not to produce, to leave their fields fallow, to actually kill off excess animals. In one of the most controversial moves, when the AAA was passed in 1933-1934, one of the first things that they mandated was that hog farmers kill off close to 50% of all American pork, and not kill them off and butcher them and sell them, because that would destroy the market. Instead, to kill them off and leave their carcasses to rot. While Americans are starving in bread lines, American farmers were killing off valuable farm animals. But according to men like Rexford Tugford, is the government, once this system was established, the government couldn't manage the agricultural sector. The TVA would provide, of course, power through, of course, government spending to allow for industrialization, to again suck up any excess labor out there. The PWA would be there to provide roads, schools, and post offices. And for the private sector, the National Recovery Act actually provided a mechanism whereupon the government would negotiate production schedules and prices with American corporations to stave off inflation, but also prevent a glut on the market. This is really the controversial element of the New Deal. It's not putting people to work. The controversial element of the New Deal is that many New Dealers believed that the free market in America could be radically changed. And many Americans at the time believed that, well, it was too big a change. Many Americans from the very class that FDR came from, because FDR was a wealthy man. FDR was from one of the, top 1% of 1% of American families. Many from that class labeled him a traitor to his class. Big business rejects the New Deal. Big business saw it as a clear and present danger to the free market system. Those within the government will reject the New Deal. It is the first New Deal that helps galvanize Republican opposition to further changes. So while many of these policies, like the CCC, sails through the Congress. However, by 1934, FDR and his New Dealers are meeting more and more resistance. They meet resistance in the form that business and localities actually sue the government. And the Supreme Court will find that the WPA and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, as well as, and most importantly, the National Recovery Act, to be unconstitutional because these institutions exceed the constitutional authority of the federal government. Now, what is FDR's response? Well, in 1935, FDR broaches a plan publicly to up the number of Supreme Court justices from the constitutional 9 to 15. FDR argues in his many radio fireside chats that that the Supreme Court, its members are they're not, they don't know the problems that your average American knows. They're unconnected. They're in their ivory tower and don't know the trials and tribulations that Americans are having to deal with. However, who gets to pick these extra 6? Of course, it would be FDR. And his critics label that FDR is trying to pack the court, to rig it to his benefit. It is a public relations nightmare for FDR. It backfires on him badly, and he has to abandon the plan. However, in the end, FDR wins because one of the sitting judges that had opposed him retires. Another one starts to vote for the New Deal. And thus, after 1935, excuse me, after 1935, there will be relatively few challenges to the New Deal from the Supreme Court. Now, interestingly enough, while the right, I hate using the dichotomy of the right and left, but let's just use it for argument's sake. While the right challenges and opposes the New Deal, while the right and members within the government, most notably the Supreme Court, at least initially, try and defeat the New Deal, some of FDR's most virulent critics come from the left. They come from people who argue that FDR's New Deal is not doing enough. For example, we have Francis Townsend. Francis Townsend is a commentator, a local politician. Townsend argues that the U.S. government should make sure that anyone over the age of 60 gets a pension. That anyone over the age of 60 is taken care of by the U.S. government. And that anybody who is under the age of 20 have a job guaranteed by the U.S. government. Likewise, you have the Catholic priest, Father Coughlin, who was made famous by his 1920s and early 1930s radio show, was mad at FDR because he did not go at big business enough. Coughlin argued for the nationalization of major industries in the country, but he also argued that the U.S. government was not doing enough against communists and Jews. And finally, probably the greatest challenger to FDR was the Louisiana governor, Huey Long. Now, Huey Long was a man who was incredibly popular in not only Louisiana, but in the surrounding states. He argued that the U.S. government should heavily tax the wealthy so that average Americans, as he called them, could be guaranteed a home, a car, and a basic income. that the government would provide a baseline for all modern necessities, according to Long. However, Long would not be able to challenge FDR because in 1935, Long is shot to death in Louisiana. He's assassinated. So, we don't know what Long could have done if he had, stayed around, because he was a charismatic politician. Now, these challenges, especially the challenge of the court, will fundamentally change the New Deal. This is why historians talk about a first New Deal and a second New Deal. The first New Deal was that New Deal that not only provided jobs, but also passed programs designed to remake American society and especially the American economy. The second New Deal, however, was aimed more at the workers themselves and the provision of what you might call a social safety net. In 1935, you see the Wagner Act passed. Now, the Wagner Act, of course, is really known as the National Labor Relations Act, and it does two things. First, it legalizes unions, allowing unions to exist and be covered by the law. It also sets up the National Labor Relations Board. Now, the National Labor Relations Board is interesting because while it has some elements of the first New Deal, it is not as strong as the National Recovery Act. The National Labor Relations Board has no power to setting prices or production quotas. Instead, it deals only with management labor issues. The National Labor Relations Board allows for, the government to step in if there is a labor dispute and there is seemingly no compromise seen in sight. The National Labor Relations Board can thus step in and referee and actually force compromise. But that's about the extent, at least of the second New Deal. Instead, the second New Deal is more about providing services and make work to people. It's the second New Deal that helps create what today we call the welfare state. It's in 1935 and 1936 that the Social Security Act is passed. Likewise, the same years, you see aid to dependent children. Now, you may think that maybe this is actually, influenced by men like Townsend, Coughlin, and Huey Long, and they may, FDR may have been responding to this because both provide baseline assistance to, in the case of Social Security, the elderly, anybody over 60. Now it's, 65. And aid to dependent children is to the youngest. So when somebody gets a check, for example, they're either an old person who maybe cannot work, or they are a mother of a dependent child. The mother is not actually getting the check. Their children are getting the check. Now, the rationale for these two programs is that they are designed to keep the weakest members of our society from starving. That's how the act was actually argued in Congress. FDR and his supporters argued that this would help make sure that the weakest in our society would at least have the basics. Now, of course, today, this is one of the problems that we will discuss in a later class. Social Security is kind of morphed into, many people believe it to be a retirement program. Initially, this was just providing enough money so that if an older couple had the choice, I've got enough money for food or rent, which are we going to do? They would have the money for both, but not to take a Vegas vacation or anything like that. For the rest of Americans, we see the sort of repackaging of the WPA into the Works Progress Administration. However, instead of being a program designed to be permanent, the WPA is given a limited lifespan that is aimed at giving people work, so that brick masons and artists and even writers could find work. As you can see here in this picture, this is one of numerous post offices. This is one thing that the WPA builds, is post offices and schools were the big structures that the WPA built. You see a post office here, of course, stonemasons and carpenters and electricians actually built the building. But here you see work given to artists. Local artists were employed to paint murals. So you have these beautiful murals that are basically make-work projects for painters. So not only do workers and artists have employment, but also writers. If we lived during the New Deal, yours truly, for example, if I did not have my job here, I could get a job with the WPA writing, say, the history of Tennessee. Some of the first state or local histories are paid for by historians and writers. The classic John Steinbeck novel, Grapes of Wrath. Steinbeck was commissioned by the WPA to write that. This is why when you watch the film, The Grapes of Wrath, keep in mind the reason why the WPA people look so good is because Steinbeck was actually being helped out by them. So we talked about culture of the 1920s. Let's talk about culture of the 1930s. Now, in some ways, culture of the 1930s is quite different, but also very similar to that of the 1920s. In the 1930s, there was an element of entertainment and escapism. Some of the most popular movies, for example, of the 1920s were things set in Arabia. Rudolph Valentino, for example, was made famous by always sort of playing sort of the suave foreign foreign hunk, if you will. However, by the 1930s, the Hollywood shows was more of escapism. We see this, of course, in the growth in popularity of cartoons, for example. Disney, for example, and Warner Brothers become popular in the 1930s because, watching Snow White allowed Americans, and especially their children, the ability to escape the problems that they were living through, to escape to another world. And this is best illustrated by the real-time movie, the actual live-action movie, The Wizard of Oz, because the whole plot of The Wizard of Oz is Dorothy escaping the Dust Bowl of the 1930s to this fantastical land of Oz. So even the movie itself, the Wizard of Oz, is a case study in how Americans in general want to get away from their problems, but at the same time, they don't want to completely escape, because at the end of the movie, sort of the message of The Wizard of Oz is that you can only escape your problems for so long, because Dorothy, of course, wants to go home. And then finally, it's during the 1930s that new technology allows the U.S. president to actually shape American culture. It's during the 1930s that, for the first time, Americans will not only hear from, but hear the actual voice of the president on a regular basis. Every week, FDR would transmit a message over whatever issue it may be, whether it be the first New Deal, the court packing scandal, the second New Deal, and finally, of course, as the war starts to brew in Europe, the war news of 1938, 1939. These fireside chats would, of course, make Americans believe that FDR was on their side. This is why I almost find it humorous, but if you went into many American homes during this time period, Americans would have a picture of Jesus over the fireplace, and right beside them would be a picture of Franklin Roosevelt. So what's the legacy of the New Deal? Well, the New Deal, love it or hate it, it plays a powerful role in establishing the federal government as a constant agent in the national economy. The fact that the government today plays a role in every aspect of our economy is cemented by the New Deal. Americans, of course, today look to Washington. Before they look to their neighbor, before they look to their local government, before they look to charity, they look to the president. The New Deal and its response to the Great Depression validated the economic principles of John Maynard Keynes. Keynes, if you ever hear somebody talking about Keynesianism, Keynesianism is simple. Keynesianism is the idea that the government must remain active in economic regulation to stave off the boom and thus the bust cycle that Keynes believed plagued Western societies. And then finally, Roosevelt and his wife, we shouldn't leave out Eleanor here, will play a role in creating a new democratic coalition, a coalition that is not just made up of Southern Democrats and laborites, but instead is a coalition made up of traditional blue-collar labor, minorities, women, and old progressives. It is this Roosevelt coalition that will keep the Democratic Party as the dominant political party in this country all the way up to the 1980s when this coalition starts to fracture and break down. Now next, we're going to talk about the sort of origins of World War II. But I'm going to take a break right now because I've been speaking for almost an hour and a half. So I'm going to go ahead and get this video ready to be uploaded. So what you guys need to do is watch this one. It will be uploaded. This is Sunday. So you'll have a complete week to watch this. But watch for the next one that I will upload, hopefully tomorrow night. If not, it will be uploaded on Tuesday. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Keep your questions, if you have any, about this lecture. Write them down. Keep them in your mind. We'll kind of talk about these two lectures before we get into World War II on Friday night. Peace out. Oh, man. I'll take a break here. Oh, please do not fucking fuck this up. Please do not fuck this up. Failed to start recording.